Look, the tip they got was chillingly specific. They weren't going to find a thing unless they moved the concrete. And let me tell you, that one phrase just sent the police into an absolute frenzy. They spent hours on end, digging up grass, dirt, even old animal bones. Then, finally, they found it. The thing they were dreading. The thing they knew they might find. Human remains. Dear Lord. Dental records would come back and confirm the remains belonged to Zoe Campos, but figuring out what the hell happened to her, that was a whole other story. Seriously, how does a totally ordinary day with friends end up like this? Well, it turns out you can't trust anyone. And you damn sure can't always trust your friends. Zoe Campos was born on September 4th, 1995. She was the youngest of 3 kids. Her dad, Alejandro, he was in the Marines, so right away, you know the Campos family moved around a lot. Straight up, right after Zoe was born, the family was just bouncing from one place to the next, Honolulu, Hawaii, then over to Round Rock, Texas. Eventually, the Campos family landed in Lubbock, Texas, and that was it. That was their permanent home. This was also right around the time Zoe's parents sadly decided to go their separate ways. And Zoe, she had to process all the emotion and frankly the trauma that comes with a huge family shift like that. Even as a little girl, Zoe just had this huge heart. She had this deep need to help every animal out there, which is why she was always bringing home strays, begging her family to help her nurse them back to health, to give them a real home. Her mom said this was just a thing with her. She'd just show up, no joke, with some new animal that needed them. By the time Zoe hit 18, she was incredibly responsible. Not a kid who got into trouble, not a party animal or anything like that. She was on a path to do some really great things. She had a couple of different dreams she was kicking around. Of course she wanted to help animals, but she was also pretty serious about the automotive world. She was actually thinking about becoming a mechanic, something like that. But one single night in November of 2013, it was going to end every single one of those dreams in a heartbeat. Because after a night out with her friends, Zoe was never coming home again. November 17th, 2013 was a really busy day for Zoe. She hung out at home all day, but when evening came, she had plans to go visit her friend, April, who had just had a baby. And we know how much Zoe loved kids, animals, babies. There was no way in hell she was going to miss seeing this newborn. April had a few other friends over too, so it was just a small get-together at her house for everybody to meet the new little one. So Zoe leaves April's place around 9 p.m., but her night wasn't over. She met up with her sister, Savannah, and the kids for dinner. The plan was to rent a movie and just have a sleepover at Savannah's Proplic. And for Zoe, this was it. This was the perfect night. You know, meeting a sweet new baby, heading back to her sister's place to hang out with her and the kids, having dinner, watching a movie, maybe a late-night snack, and then just crashing. Life was good, but it was about to end in just pure tragedy. After the movie was over, they all went to bed. Zoe was sleeping on the couch. The next morning, November 18th, Savannah comes out of her bedroom to get ready for work, and she sees that Zoe is just gone. Now, right away, that's alarming for Savannah. Zoe was not the kind of person who would just get up and leave and not tell a soul. So Savannah does the first thing you do, she calls Zoe's phone, but it just rings. No answer. When Savannah looks out the window, she sees Zoe's car is gone too, so her first thought is, okay, maybe she had to leave in the middle of the night for some reason. The next thing Savannah does is call her mom, Melinda, who had been working her shift at a local bar the night before, and this is when Savannah finds out about something strange. Something that proves Zoe had, in fact, left the house last night. See, Melinda had been working, and at around 2:30 in the morning, she gets a message, and it's from Zoe. It was a little weird, for sure, but not, terrifying or anything. Zoe was just asking her mom if she needed a ride home from work. And for context, Melinda's car was in the shop, so she was actually really grateful. She thought, great, Zoe's coming to get me. Here's the thing though, Zoe never showed up. Melinda waited outside that bar for almost 30 minutes, calling Zoe's phone over and over, but nothing. She wasn't too worried though. She just figured Zoe must have fallen asleep or something. So Melinda made the short walk over to a friend's house and just crashed there for the night. But then she gets that call from Savannah, and it hits her that nobody, not a single person, has heard from Zoe. And that's when the anxiety really set in for both of them. They called everyone they could think of. Zoe's friends, local hospitals, but it was the same story everywhere. No one had seen her. No one had heard from her. That's when Melinda and Savannah finally called the police, around 5 p.m. But the detectives, man, they were in no hurry to file a missing person report. They pulled that classic police move, suggesting she'd probably just run away, that she was just blowing off some steam somewhere. What the hell? The detectives straight up said they wanted to wait a full 24 hours before they would officially list her as missing, which, honestly, is just unacceptable. I don't care what the circumstances are. So you've got Melinda and Savannah trying to reason with these investigators, stressing to them that this is not Zoe. She would never just take off like that. For real. She had absolutely no reason to. But did the detectives listen? Number. Of course they didn't. They did exactly what they said they'd do and refused to list her as a missing person until the next day. They did, however, eventually put out an APB for Zoe's Lincoln Town car. And they didn't have to wait long for a hit, because the very next day, Zoe's aunt, Monica, spotted that car on the road. Okay, so the windows on the car were tinted, right? She couldn't get a good look at the driver's face, but Monica knew one thing for damn sure: it wasn't Zoe. She told police it looked like some guy, maybe in his 20s, and he was wearing a hoodie, and he was the one driving Zoe's car. So she and her son, they immediately start following the car. They're trying their best to keep up, but then it makes a sharp turn, and just like that, it's gone. They totally lost it. Eventually, though, the car turns up. It was found abandoned at the Driftwood Apartments. And get this, that just so happened to be the exact same complex where Zoe was living. I mean, what are the odds? Monica calls the police, lets them know she found the car, and when the detectives get there, they search the whole thing, but there was no sign of Zoe anywhere. And for Monica, this was, man, it must have been equal parts dreadful and relieving. Because the entire time she was tailing that car, she was terrified that Zoe was trapped inside, with the driver. But the relief doesn't last, because the grim reality is still haunting everyone. Zoe is nowhere. She just vanished without a trace. What the investigators did find in the car was duct tape, Zoe's black jacket, some unknown sweatshirt that they figured belonged to the man, and a phone charger. All of this was taken into evidence, and the clothes were sent off immediately for forensic testing. In the meantime, detectives are also digging through Zoe's phone records, and even though they couldn't get an exact location from her phone, they could pinpoint the last known activity, and it was near a place called Lowry Field. Now, you have to understand something about Lowry Field. It is not a safe place. It's sketchy, at best. We're talking a lot of criminal dealings, adult work happening in that area. So you can imagine the absolute shock from Zoe's family when they find out her last known location was anywhere near there. I mean, considering Zoe was about as clean-cut as a person can get, she most definitely was not involved in adult work or any other kind of crime for that matter. So why on earth would she be here? Of all places. Was she kidnapped? Did someone lure her out there? And the biggest question, was she even still alive? As the police are trying to sort all this out, they start talking to everyone in Zoe's life. The first person of interest was her ex-boyfriend, Joe. He and Zoe had dated for a long time before they mutually decided to call it quits. There was seriously no bad blood there, and Joe seemed genuinely worried sick about Zoe and where she could be. On top of that, Joe had a completely airtight alibi for the night Zoe went missing. The next person was another young man named Jacob. Zoe had also dated him for a bit, but that ended when she found out he cheated on her. But even though they had a messy breakup, Jacob also had a pretty solid alibi for that night. And look, even though he was sort of your typical bad boy who was always getting into trouble, there was zero evidence that could convince detectives that Jacob had anything to do with any of this. All right, the next person on their radar was a guy named Ben. And this is interesting. Ben was actually someone Zoe's mom, Melinda, had dated. So why were police questioning him? Well, Zoe's phone records showed that on the night she went missing, she made a call to him, to Ben. The question was just, why? So, investigators call him in for questioning, they even give him a polygraph test, but they hit another dead end. Ben also had a solid alibi, and he didn't seem dodgy or closed off at all during the interview. If anything, he was just as worried as everyone else. So the detectives were right back at square one. But there was one more thing they had to circle back to, and that was the little get-together at April's house that Zoe went to. They wanted to speak to anyone and everyone who was at that party. Maybe someone saw Zoe with another person. Maybe someone could give them more details about how she was acting before she disappeared. Was she scared? Was she her normal self? All the basic questions. And that's when everyone from the party was questioned. And one of them was a man named Carlos Rodriguez. He was first questioned by police back on November 25th, and he gave them his version of events. Carlos was basically a friend of a friend. He knew Zoe through a mutual acquaintance, so they didn't really know each other well personally, but they were, friendly. Carlos told police that he and Zoe left the party around the same time, and that he had no idea what happened after that. Now, you might be thinking this is just another dead end, that the detectives are just wasting their time. Carlos didn't really know Zoe, so how could he possibly know what happened to her, right? Well, something about Carlos and his story just didn't sit right with the police. They couldn't do anything about it, they had no evidence, but they decided to keep tabs on this guy, just in case. 2 weeks later, on December 9th, Carlos was called back to the police station for another interview. And this time, in a sworn statement, Carlos's story changed, completely. He went on to admit that what he told them on November 25th was a total lie. Carlos did in fact meet up with Zoe afterward, but not in the way you'd think. They had added each other on Facebook and started chatting there, and Carlos invited Zoe over to his house to smoke some illegal substances. Now, Carlos admitted that he wanted to be friends with Zoe, or maybe something more. He just wanted to have a good time with her. He said that Zoe did come over that night, but that he didn't actually have any illegal substances on him. So, Zoe leaves to go get some for them, and she never came back. Now, this whole story is just bizarre. First of all, and I know I sound like a broken record saying this, but Zoe didn't do illegal substances. It just wasn't her. So how the hell would she know where to even find them, especially at that insane hour of the night? Second, even with Carlos swearing up and down that he had zero to do with her disappearance, come on. He was technically the last person to be with her. That is just classic suspect behavior, and the detectives knew it. And if that wasn't already suspicious enough, you want to take a wild guess where Carlos's house was located? If you remember, Zoe's last known location was within a single mile of that very spot. Holy shit. But it wasn't going to be easy for the investigators to convict Carlos of whatever he did to Zoe, because there was just no physical evidence that could tie him to her being gone. So the detectives, they had to question Carlos again and again, just hoping that maybe he would slip up, that he'd give them some more details. In the meantime, Carlos's house was also searched by the police. But since he had recently moved out, a lot of things had changed, and finding evidence was getting harder and harder. But hey, remember that men's sweatshirt they found in Zoe's car? Well, bam. It turned out that belonged to Carlos. And get this, forensic tests confirmed that DNA found on that jacket belonged to Zoe. So Carlos couldn't deny it any longer. He was with Zoe the night she disappeared. And as much as it kills me to say this, after that huge break, the investigation into Zoe's disappearance just stalls. For years, Zoe went missing in November of 2013. And now we're fast forwarding a little over 4 years, and Carlos is being hauled in for questioning for what feels like the 100th time. But this time around, the interview isn't at the police station. No, it's being held at the Lubbock County Correctional Center. Now, why, you ask? Well, it turns out our guy Carlos was now an inmate there. He was charged with stalking an ex-girlfriend of his, so you can already guess what kind of guy we're dealing with by this point. And it also turns out that for 4 straight years, this guy withheld information about Zoe, even when the police were dead certain he knew more than he was letting on. It wasn't until July of 2018 that a break finally comes. An inmate from the same jail where Carlos was locked up, he comes to the detectives with some incredibly disturbing information. This inmate claimed that he was talking with Carlos about his own homicide case, and Carlos just flat out told him that they'd never find anything unless they moved the concrete. This was the biggest lead in Zoe's case so far, and the investigators immediately went to Carlos's former home to do exactly what they had to do: move the concrete. With the help of cadaver dogs, detectives honed in on a particular area in the backyard, an area they figured had been covered by concrete. But oddly enough, the police never actually mentioned finding any concrete. But soon enough, when they dug around, they came across some bones, and they were horrified by this discovery. Without wasting any time, the police sent the remains for testing. But the results were not what they expected. The remains were not human. They were animal remains. I mean, you can just imagine how depressing this was for the police, how anticlimactic. They get this one huge lead from this guy who's been stonewalling them for years, and it turns into nothing. But the detectives, they decided to play a little game with Carlos. Now, sure, the remains weren't Zoe's, no, but the investigators were certain they just needed to find the right place to look. So they go visit Carlos again and start asking some questions. During the questioning, the detectives just casually bring up the bones found in his old backyard, hoping to get a reaction out of him. Luckily, they did. It was like the police could literally see Carlos shutting down right in front of them. He was panicking, but he calmly asked for an attorney and said he wouldn't be cooperating with the detectives anymore, as if he ever cooperated in the first place. But that reaction, that was all the investigators needed. And here's the really interesting part at that moment. Even the detectives didn't know for sure that the bones were animal remains. The test results hadn't come back yet. But they still used this to poke at Carlos, to see what would happen. Honestly, a pretty smart move. They knew for sure now. Carlos had done something terrible to Zoe. And as much as they were horrified to even think it, they now knew that Carlos's backyard had more than just animal bones. 5 years after Zoe vanished, Carlos was finally ready to talk. See, in his mind, the game was up. He believed the police had already found Zoe's remains, and the detectives just let him think that. So this is what happened to Zoe the night she tragically lost her life. We already know by now that she and Carlos agreed to meet up at his house. Some sources also said that once they got there, things got intimate between the two of them. But what actually happened next is that they smoked cigarettes that had been laced with a highly illegal substance. Now, we don't know for sure if Zoe knew what was in them, if she was forced, or if she did it willingly. That part, we just don't know. But let me be clear. What these cigarettes were laced with was a seriously psychoactive chemical. This wasn't the kind of stuff you can buy a variation of at some local gas station. This was the kind of stuff that'll send you straight to another planet, causing these intense hallucinations and a complete and total loss of your grip on reality. So Carlos confessed that after they smoked, he turned to look at Zoe, but he didn't see her sitting there. He said he saw a demon, and it terrified him, and as a result, he struck Zoe with all of his might, before taking her life with his bare hands. Oh my God. Once he knew that Zoe was no longer alive, Carlos dug a shallow grave in his backyard and buried her body there. And then, I guess after he came down from the high, he realized what he'd done. Because get this, a couple of months later, Carlos actually dug Zoe's body back up and buried her deeper in the backyard so that nobody would find her. So, wait a sec. Carlos hallucinated and saw Zoe as a demon? Or so he says, but he was coherent enough to dig a grave and bury her right afterward? That's the part that just does not add up for me. If he was as far gone as he's claiming he was, this man wouldn't have been able to even lift a shovel, let alone dig a grave. And honestly, it's just so infuriating to think that Carlos, instead of snapping out of it or calling for help, thought that the most reasonable option was to end Zoe's life, and then just cover the whole thing up. It's unbelievable. But I guess in his mind, it was all going to be fine, because he was never going to get caught. But he would never have guessed how wrong he truly was. Carlos was taken back to his old home. And after he pointed out the exact location and they started digging, on November 16th, 2018, the detectives found another set of remains. And, unfortunately, this time, they weren't animal remains. Dental records confirmed it. The remains did, in fact, belong to 18-year-old Zoe Campos. Carlos was immediately arrested and charged with Zoe's murder. But Carlos, the master of dragging things out for an impossibly long time, pleaded not guilty. So now he was just waiting for his trial behind bars. In the meantime, he wrote a letter to the media, basically confirming that he had ended Zoe's life. And this letter was filled with details on what he did to her and how supposedly sorry he was. And what's infuriating is that Carlos goes on to say that the guilt of keeping this a secret was just weighing on him. Seriously? Yet he managed to keep that little secret for 5 years? And to top it all off, he still pleaded not guilty. That's the part that really blows my mind. He all but confessed to the crime in the media, yet in a court of law, still claimed he was innocent. It doesn't even make sense. But hold on, because this next bit will make your blood boil even more. Carlos went on to address the Campos family and apologize to them for their loss. But still, Carlos stressed that he is not a murderer and that it was the hallucinations that made him do it in the first place. But Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, but you made a choice to smoke that substance knowing full well what it was capable of. In my book, that makes you fully responsible for whatever happens after the fact. But all that aside, he then begged the Campos family to forgive him and not seek revenge. He had the absolute nerve to tell them to remember not to seek revenge, but to seek justice. To not hate their enemies, but to love and forgive them. I am truly, honestly, at a complete loss for words. But let's just get back to the trial, because this nuisance deserves to suffer behind bars for what he did to Zoe. The trial was held in 2022, and the jury, they wasted no time coming to a decision. 29-year-old Carlos Rodriguez was found guilty of murdering Zoe Campos, and he was sentenced to life in prison. And get this, it only took the jury 14 minutes to decide on that sentence. 14 minutes. That's how guilty this man was. Zoe's family felt like they were hit by a tidal wave when they found out the investigators had finally recovered her remains. Her mom and her sister were just so devastated by what happened to Zoe. To not see or hear from your child for more than 5 years, living in this pit of uncertainty and dealing with leads that were more and more horrific as they went. These 5 years were just brutal for Zoe's family. The only, and I mean only, silver lining in any of this is that they finally got to bring Zoe home and lay her to rest peacefully. Zoe's funeral was held on December 4th, 2018, and everyone said their final goodbyes to a young woman who would have been a pet lover, a dang good mechanic, and just a source of joy for everyone around her. Zoe's mom, Melinda. She says she misses her daughter's warm smile and her voice so terribly. She said that having to plan her own daughter's funeral was the hardest, most heartbreaking thing she's ever had to do in her life, and that she just prays no other parent ever has to go through something like that. Oh God. You can only hope that the Campos family can somehow find some kind of peace after a loss this tremendous, because there are literally no words to describe how awful this entire case was. Look, illegal substances are bad enough on their own. They can ruin lives in every single sense of the word. And even if you believe that Carlos had no intention of harming Zoe when the night began, it's just another horrible example of how catastrophic this stuff is, and how losing yourself to it, it's only going to lead to absolute heartache one way or another.